Your Honor, as we discussed previously, both parties are moving for a separation of witnesses, which is traditional in any case. But we have agreed that that shall go into effect after opening statements at the first time somebody testifies.
That's correct, Your Honor.
All right. The court will grant that joint motion and order a separation of witnesses. That means that, and that will be effective after opening statements. Anyone who is to be called as a witness in this case may not be present in the courtroom following opening statements until called to testify. Any witness who does testify may not discuss his or her testimony with any other prospective witness. Violations of that order can result in sanctions, including the exclusion of testimony. It's the court's understanding, too, that counsel wishes that to apply to any, prevent any prospective witness from viewing, listening to, or reading anything about any other testimony. Is that correct?
That's correct, Judge.
That is correct, Your Honor.
All right, then that order will be applied also to any written or recorded testimony. No witness who is to be called can view, listen to, or read anything concerning other testimony until called. The court does have some preliminary instructions, ladies and gentlemen, that I want to advise you of. It may help you if you follow these instructions, it may help you in performing your duties as jurors in this case. Jury service is somewhat strange, I'm sure, to all of you. Even if you've served as a juror before, it's not something you've done often, so an explanation may be helpful. Those who participate in a trial must do so in accordance with established rules. And that's true of witnesses, it's true of the lawyers, it's true of the judge, and also true of the jurors. The lawyers present the evidence according to those rules. The judge enforces the rules and determines what evidence may be admitted. You will be the sole judges of the facts, the credibility of the witnesses, and the weight to be given to their testimony. Now later, the court will instruct you as to the law that applies to the case, and you will apply that law to the facts as you find them. It is your sworn duty to apply the law as given to you by the court. The procedure for trial is as follows. First, counsel will outline what they expect the evidence will be. These are referred to as opening statements, is what how they're referred to. And these opening statements of counsel are not evidence, but they are a preview of the claims of each party, and they are designed to help you follow the evidence as it is presented. Then the state offers its evidence. Now, the defendant may but need not offer evidence. If the defendant presents evidence, then the state may present rebuttal evidence. The trial then concludes with the arguments of counsel, sometimes referred to as summation, then the instructions of law given to you by the court, and thereafter you will deliberate concerning your verdict. It is important that you be fair and attentive throughout the trial. Do not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else. This includes family, friends, and media. You must not post or read anything about this case on the internet or any electronic device, including cell phones. This would include blogs and social networking sites such as MySpace, Facebook, Twitter, and others. Any such discussion, if discovered, could lead to a mistrial and would severely compromise the rights of the parties to a fair trial. Do not permit anyone to discuss this case with you or in your presence. Do not form or express any opinion on this case until it is finally submitted to you. It may perhaps be more difficult for you to understand that you may not discuss this case among yourselves until it is finally submitted to you. The reason is that you will receive the opening statements of counsel, the evidence, the closing arguments of counsel, and the law in that order. And it would be unfair to discuss the case among yourselves before you receive everything necessary for your decision. You should explain this rule prohibiting the discussion of the case to your family and friends. When the trial is over and your jury duty is completed, you will then be released from this admonition, and you at that time may, but are not required to, discuss the case and your experiences as a juror. You are instructed not to talk to the attorneys, parties, witnesses, or anyone else that participates in the trial. Likewise, they may not talk with you. You must not talk with anyone else about this case during the trial. If anyone should attempt to discuss this case with you, report the incident to me or to one of the court's employees immediately. Do not investigate or attempt to obtain additional information about this case from any source outside the courtroom. Now, this includes revisiting any of the places that you were taken on the jury view. You are instructed not to view pictures obtained on your own, including those obtained on the internet, such as Google Earth and others. Viewing the scene in an unauthorized manner, viewing pictures or other materials without the benefit of explanation in court is unfair to the parties who need you to decide this case solely on the evidence presented in the courtroom. You are prohibited from performing your own experiments and conducting your own research, including internet research. Such information may be incomplete, inaccurate, or irrelevant to the issues in the case. It is vital that you carefully follow these instructions. The reason is simple. The law requires that you consider only the testimony and evidence you hear and see in the courtroom. You may consider and decide this case only upon the evidence received at the trial. If you acquire any information from an outside source, you must report it immediately to the bailiff of the court or one of the employees of the court who are performing bailiff duties, and they will report it to me. You are instructed not to read, view, or listen to any report in the newspaper, radio, or television on the subject of this trial. Do not permit anyone to read or comment upon them to you or in your presence. Media reports may be incomplete or inaccurate. You may consider and decide this case only upon the evidence received at the trial. If you acquire any information from an outside source, you must not report it to other jurors, and you must disregard it in your deliberations. In addition, you shall report and should report the outside source of information to one of the court's employees or to the judge at the first opportunity. All or portions of these proceedings may be broadcast, photographed, and or recorded by members of the news media. You must not allow this fact to divert your attention from this case or to interfere with your duties as jurors. Further, you are not allowed to talk to members of the media during this trial. Any violation of these orders may require a new trial and may subject those involved to sanctions, including contempt of court. The court will permit, I haven't asked counsel about this, but it would be typically the court's position that note-taking should be permitted in a trial of this length. Is that acceptable with counsel for each side?
It is, Your Honor.
Yeah.
It is, Your Honor.
The court will permit those jurors who desire to take notes during the trial to do so. We'll provide you with those notepads, and we'll probably do that even prior to opening statement. No juror is required to take notes. The taking of notes is entirely a matter of personal choice for each juror. The fact that the notes taken by a juror support his or her recollection in no way makes his or her memory more reliable than that of the jurors who do not take notes. Do not let the taking of notes divert your attention from what is being said or is happening in the courtroom during the trial. Some persons believe that taking notes is not helpful because it may distract a person's attention and interfere with hearing all the evidence. All notes are confidential and for the consideration of the jury only. Each note taker will leave his or her notes on his or her chair during the recesses and until deliberations begin. At that time, you will be allowed to take your notes to the jury room. All notes will be returned to the court reporter for destruction after the time the jury is discharged, or at the time the jury is discharged. Jurors will not be permitted to ask questions of the witnesses. It is the responsibility of the lawyers to present all the evidence necessary for you to decide the issues in this case. If during the trial issues arise that would affect your ability to pay attention and sit as a fair and impartial juror, you must explain the matter to the bailiff of the court or one of the employees of the court acting as bailiffs, who will inform me. At any time, if you cannot hear a witness, an attorney, or me, please make that fact known immediately by raising your hand. As to each offense charged in the indictment, the defendant is presumed innocent unless and until his guilt is established beyond a reasonable doubt. As to each offense charged in the indictment, the defendant must be acquitted unless the state produces evidence which convinces you beyond a reasonable doubt of every essential element of each such offense charged. I've used the term reasonable doubt, and at this time I will define that term for you. Reasonable doubt is present when the jurors, after they have carefully considered and compared all the evidence, cannot say they are firmly convinced of the truth of the charge. It is a doubt based on reason and common sense. Reasonable doubt is not mere possible doubt, because everything relating to human affairs or depending on moral evidence is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof of such character that an ordinary person would be willing to rely and act upon it in the most important of the person's own affairs. You are the sole judges of the facts, the credibility of the witnesses, and the weight of the evidence. To weigh the evidence, you must consider the credibility of witnesses. You will use the tests of truthfulness which you use in your daily lives. These tests include the appearance of each witness upon the stand, the witness's manner of testifying, the reasonableness of the testimony, the opportunity the witness had to see, hear, and know the things about which the witness testified, the witness's accuracy of memory, frankness or lack of it, intelligence, interest, and bias, if any, together with all the facts and circumstances surrounding the testimony. Use these tests and assign to each witness's testimony such weight as you think proper. You are not required to believe the testimony of any witness simply because the witness was under oath. You may believe or disbelieve all or any part of the testimony of any witness. It is your duty to decide what testimony to believe and what testimony not to believe. The testimony of one witness, if believed by you, is sufficient to prove any disputed fact. I may remind you of these instructions from time to time. If I overlook that, however, they nevertheless apply to your conduct throughout this trial. Now, by now you each found your parking place out here inside the fence, I would assume. And since you now know where that is, it will be easier each succeeding day for you to find where to park. If any of you need work slips for your employer for employment purposes, see one of the employees of the court or the clerk, and we'll make sure you get a work slip. There may from time to time be bench conferences, whispering at the bench. You are totally to ignore that. It's not that, those conferences are not meant for the jury. You know where our restrooms are by now. We've had a few days here in the courtroom, so you know where they are, and they are what they are. But and hopefully we'll have no problems that way. We'll try to accommodate anybody who needs a restroom trip. You've got juror badges. I see that you're all wearing your badges. We'll be sending those home with you. That's a little different than we normally do, but since we have specific parking places for you, those identify you as jurors. Try to remember to wear them each day so you'll be identified when you get into the juror parking places. Let me just say too, if you forget your badge and you're halfway here, don't turn around and go back to get your badge and make yourself late for court. Come on to court, identify yourself, say you forgot your badge, and we'll make sure that you get in where you need to be. But try to remember to wear your badges. If you have any problems at all, tell one of the people serving as bailiff of the court. We'll try to take care of each problem in an expeditious manner. Does counsel wish me to give any other advisements at this time?
No, thank you, Judge.
No, Your Honor.
All right. We begin every trial, ladies and gentlemen, with opening statements. You will see throughout the course of this trial that frequently the state of Ohio is required to go first and then the defendant to go second. That's true of opening statements as well. Again, the order in which we proceed at trial is a matter of longstanding procedure, and we're required to follow it in this trial. Opening statements are not evidence and may not in themselves be weighed as evidence. They may, however, be very useful to you as jurors in understanding the evidence as it's presented. Now, the prosecuting attorney, if prepared to go forward at this time, may begin your opening statement.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start this with an apology because I think we owe you an apology, and also, again, gratitude for your patience throughout this process. We've tried to warn you that it's going to be a long process, and you guys persevered regardless of those warnings. But starting back in July, when you showed up at the gymnasium and filled out, a 20-page questionnaire, and then showed up for individual questioning, and then again for general questioning, and then literally weathered a jury view, 2-day jury view, where it was kind of hot on that bus, I think. And then the delay. We sincerely apologize for the delay that happened. None of us wanted that to happen. Obviously, we have 6 alternate jurors in case something happens to one of you original 12, but we don't have that ability if something happens to the participants. So again, I apologize for that. We all would have liked to have started this last week, especially when the jury view was still fresh in your mind. Especially, it would be nice to be sitting here saying we have 1 week under our belts of a 6 to 8 week trial, right? But again, our apologies for that and our gratitude for you to continue persevering. Also, thanking you in advance for the amount of patience that you're going to have to show over the next 6 to 8 weeks. We will be trying to streamline this as much as possible. So, we will try not to call 12 witnesses if we can do it with 2 or whatever the case may be. One of the things that you might see us doing is calling a witness more than once. And we're doing that because we want to present this case to you in a chronological fashion so that it makes sense. So for instance, our ballistics expert, for instance, did some work at the beginning of the case and then very at the tail end and some in the middle, right? Well, it wouldn't make much sense for him to sit up here and talk about the tail end of things when you guys haven't even been introduced to that evidence, okay? So in that fashion, you might see us doing that with some of our witnesses. So we won't be able to offer you that explanation then, so I'm offering it to you now. Additionally, what was I going to say? Oh, we might have to call jurors or witnesses out of order. I just got done saying we're going to try to present it to you in a streamlined fashion so that it makes sense chronologically. But due to schedules and stuff like that, we can't always do that. So we apologize if we do end up having to call somebody out of order. Okay, let's talk about why we are here. We are here, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, because this defendant, George Wagner IV, AKA George Wagner, and his brother, Edward Jacob Wagner, and his father, George Wagner III, also known as Billy Wagner. The three of them, in the late hours of April 21st of 2016 into the early morning hours of April 22nd of 2016, went up to Union Hill Road to 3 different locations that you all saw, and 1 location out on Left Fork Road, and murdered 8 people who did not deserve to die. I want that to sink in. They killed people who did nothing to justify the death sentence that they received at the hands of the defendant and his brother and his father. And in part, you will learn his mother, who helped in the planning and plotting of this. This was not a crime of passion. This was not in a fit of rage. This was not in self-defense. These murders happened after a period of 3 months of planning and plotting and purchasing and preparing and executing 8 individuals of a family. The question that has been asked the most over the past 6.5 years is why? Why did 4 individuals plot to kill 8 members of another family? And I think you will be disappointed to learn that there is no good reason. Now, I say that. There's rarely ever a good reason to kill somebody. But you, at some point in the middle of this trial, or certainly by the end of this trial, it will dawn on you that these murders should have never happened. It was the result of a series of misguided decisions by the defendant and his family. You will learn that some of the people they intended to kill, other people were killed simply because they were there. And you will learn that the defendants knew that before they walked out of the door that night to kill these individuals, that there might be other people there. And they all agreed those people would have to be killed too, regardless of the fact that they literally had no issue with any of those other individuals. They decided that those people would have to die too. And it could have been much worse. You will learn that little Chris, one of the victims in this case, 16-year-old Christopher Rhoden, often had friends spend the night. It was highly unusual that he didn't. Fortunately for his friends, he was grounded because he came home late the night before, and his parents took away his car, and he wasn't allowed to have his friend over. But if there had been a friend laying on the couch, as he would have been, you will learn without a doubt that they would have killed him too. Corey Holdren, who was the boyfriend of Hannah Mae Rhoden, also could very well have been there. And if he had been there, you will learn they absolutely would have killed him too. Again, people they had no issue with, they were willing to kill indiscriminately with no reason. I'd like to start by introducing you to the 8 people who were killed and telling you a little bit about them and why they were. Okay, these are the 8 individuals who were killed, like I said, late night, April 21st. Can you not see?
I just asked about taking notes. Are we going to be able to go straight up in statements?
I'm sorry.
The juror is asking if they can take notes during openings.
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry. I meant to ask Terry, would you get the jurors' notepads now?
Judge, can we approach just for a moment?
Yeah. All right, you each have your notepads now, and thank you for reminding me of that. And you may certainly take notes during opening statements. Again, I just remind you that the opening statements of each attorney are not in and of themselves evidence, but are designed to help you understand the evidence as it's presented. You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I've been asked not to stray too far from the microphone. Again, our court reporter has trouble hearing if we do, so I'm going to try to anchor myself here a little bit. Okay, so Christopher Rhoden Sr., and Gary Rhoden, Frankie Rhoden, Hannah Hazel Gilly, Dana Rhoden, Hannah Mae Rhoden, Chris Rhoden Jr., and Kenneth Rhoden. Chris Rhoden Sr. is 40 years old, was 40 years old at the time of his death. He lived at 4077 Union Hill Road, which was that very first address that we got out on the jury view. The very first one we went to. There was a shed there. There was a big, huge gray building. So hopefully you guys remember this from. But he was married to Dana Rhoden in 1994, and they divorced 13 years later, but for all practical purposes, they lived as husband and wife. They did not live together, but for instance, he purchased the trailer that she lived in at 3199 Union Hill Road about a month before the homicide. So he worked at Big Bear Lake every day. He operated heavy equipment and did construction, built decks and stuff like that. And alongside of Gary and Shannon Miller. People would describe Chris Sr. as a generous person. He would help family members. One of those examples is Bobby Jo Manley, whom you will hear from. She lived on his property for $150 a month, and in exchange, she would feed his animals every week, on every other day basis or frequently throughout the week. Another individual was buying a car from him that he never would have been able to afford, but again, Chris let him work that off by mowing the lawn or helping with feeding the animals, of which they had many. You see here that on April 21st of 2016, his last outgoing text was to Dana Rhoden, his former wife. And that was at 10:53 p.m. And you can see that his last outgoing contact was to Billy Wagner at 10:55 p.m. And that time will become very important to you when you learn its significance. Gary Rhoden was 38 years old at the time he was killed. He lived with Christopher Rhoden on occasion. He was from Kentucky, but he would come and stay with his cousin, and in so doing, he would work at Big Bear Lake and help make a living. So he worked alongside Christopher Rhoden Sr., and he was last seen at 8:30 p.m. by another individual there at both at his residence and down at 3122 Union Hill Road. Dana Rhoden was 37 years old at the time she was killed. She's the daughter of Leonard and Judy, and she is one of 4 siblings. James Manley is her brother, Bobby Joe is her sister, and Kathy Clay is another sister. She married Chris Rhoden. We already talked about this. They had 3 children together, Frankie Rhoden, Hannah Mae Rhoden, and Christopher Rhoden Jr., or Little Chris, as most people called him. She worked at Hillside Nursing and Rehabilitation Center. She pulled a double shift on April 21st of 2016. She started around 8 o'clock in the morning, and she worked until a little bit after 11 p.m. And she was last seen on video surveillance at the People's One Stop, and she was seen having a conversation with her friend and coworker, Angela Pease, around from 11:15 to 11:30 p.m. And the last outgoing contact was a series of text messages to her former husband that were unanswered. And she definitely relished in her role as grandmother. Even Angela Wagner would say that the grandchildren adored her. She would have cookouts and do other fun things for them when she had them. Frankie Rhoden was 20 years old. He had just started a new job doing construction. This was in keeping with what he had gone to vocational school for 3 years. His teacher there knew that Frankie considered him a mentor. He was in constant contact with him, even though he had already graduated. And the teacher knew that Frankie had just started this job, again, that was in keeping with the skills that he learned at school. He had 2 children, 2 sons. One was Clarence Brentley, is what he went by. He was 3 years old at the time his father was killed. And he also had a 6-month-old son named Ruger, who was actually laying in the bed with Frankie and Hannah Hazel when both of them were killed. He spent the day working with Cody Manley. He is seen by himself on surveillance camera purchasing groceries at Rhoden One Stop. His last outgoing contact was a phone call to Chelsea Robinson. Chelsea is the mother of Brentley. She had called him that evening and asked if he would be able to watch Brentley because the kids at the daycare were sick and she had to work. They had a very good relationship, and he consented to having Brentley come over, and that's why Brentley was there that night. The last activity we see on his phone is just before 11 p.m. He takes a picture of both of his children sleeping. He was dating Hannah Hazel Gilley, the mother of Ruger, and intended to marry her. They were living together at the time they were killed. Hannah Gilley was also 20 years old when she was killed. She is the daughter of Andrea Carver and Ray Gilley, engaged to Frankie Rhoden, had a son. One son, who was her first child, 6-month-old. She was nursing him. She was not working at the time. She was simply providing care to their child. And she had been at that residence since the day before. And her last outgoing contact was to her sister at just before 1 a.m. Hannah Rhoden, Hannah Mae Rhoden, had just turned 19 a few weeks prior to her death. She resided at 3122 Union Hill Road. I guess I should back up. Frankie and Hazel lived at 4099, no, I'm doing that wrong, 4199 Union Hill Road. If you recall, we had you walk from one location to the other, and you kind of went through a, it was mowed grass, but then stuff on the side, and you were asked to kind of look around as you traveled that direction. Because Frankie and Hazel lived, it's approximately a half a mile from the front doorstep of Chris Sr. To that second place where there was only a porch left, but that's where Frankie and Hazel lived. Dana and Hannah Mae and little Chris lived together at 3122 Union Hill Road. And they had just moved there approximately a month prior to that, a little less than a month prior to that. So, and living there as well was Kylie Rhoden, which is the daughter that Hannah Mae had given birth to 5 days before she was killed. Her daughter, Sophia Wagner, who was almost 3 years old, not quite, she was 2.5 years old. I know it says 3 years old up there. But she also lived there when she was not with her father, Jake Wagner. So Jake Wagner was the father of Sophia Wagner. Her last outgoing contact was a text to Corey Holdren. Corey Holdren was supposed to spend the night that night with her, but his sister's water pipes burst, and so he had to leave to help his sister with that emergency. Otherwise, he also would have been there. And lastly, Chris Rhoden Jr. also lived there at that residence with his mother and his sister. Again, he had just been grounded because he had been out late. He was dating a girl at the time of the homicides. He was a freshman in high school. He had just got his driver's license a few months prior. And his last outgoing contact was a Snapchat just before midnight to Brandy Taylor. There he is getting his license. I'd like to go back. So you will learn that Chris Rhoden Sr. was one of the intended targets of the Wagners, and you will learn that's because he was the patriarch of the family, and they considered basically that if they kind of got rid of him, that the structure of the family would fall. And they also knew that if they only killed Hannah Mae, who was really their true target, right, that he would know who did it, and that would either get them arrested or he would retaliate and try to kill one of them. That's the reason he was killed. Gary Rhoden was killed simply because he was there. Now, they knew that he often stayed there and likely knew that he was going to be there that night, and again, were perfectly comfortable with killing him regardless. Frankie Rhoden knew that his sister had complained about the violence that Jake had exhibited upon her, and he found this out, Jake Wagner found that out when he was speaking with Dana Rhoden the week of the homicides, and Dana had shared that with him, and that, again, he would know that it was the Wagners that killed them. Hannah Hazel Gilley, again, she was collateral damage the Wagners were willing to take on to get to the other people that they wanted to kill. Dana Rhoden, again, her crime, she was allegedly not even one of the targets. She was allegedly collateral damage, but I think you will learn that she almost had to be a intended target, because you will learn that they waited for her to return to the residence after she got off of work. But again, she knew some of the things that Jake had said to Hannah Mae. She knew that he had said to her that if she left with Sophia, tried tried to leave with Sophia that he would kill her and bury her body where her family couldn't find it. And so Dana confronted Jake Wagner with that information when he came to the residence the week of the homicides. Hannah Mae Rhoden. Her crime was not returning the love of Jake Wagner, not submitting to the control of the Wagners. And you will learn that that is the character of this family was very controlling of any women who came into their circle. So any women who dated, had children with George Wagner, any women who dated or had children with Jacob Wagner. And we have 3 prime examples of this. But for Hannah Mae's purpose, she was a little bit stronger than the others, and that is why she ended up being killed. Chris Rhoden Jr. Was an intended target, again, because he lived in the same residence, would know who did this, and that would cause an arrest or retaliation. Kenneth Rhoden was kind of an add-on. He was the one who lived out on Left Fork, where we drove down, and there was like construction down there on Left Fork. We drove past it at one point, and then we allowed you to stop and get out and walk up into that area. Kenneth Rhoden and Chris Rhoden Sr. were very close to each other. Kenneth Rhoden worked in Columbus, Ohio, at U.S. Utilities Company, and he had no running water at his residence, so he would get up at 4:30 in the morning and drive over to Chris Sr.'s and take a shower, and then go on to work. And there had been prior occasions where Chris Rhoden had been hurt, and Kenneth retaliated on his behalf. So the Wagners very much knew that about Kenneth, and so they decided that he had to be killed because, again, he would know who it was, and he also knew that the Wagners were going to be there that night, so he knew they had to kill him. Okay, so let's talk about how is it that 4 individuals plot and plan and conspire and prepare and execute 8 individuals. And you will learn that they were killed, most of them were killed while they were sleeping or in their beds, with the exception of Chris Sr. and Gary Rhoden, who were awake. It kind of starts with a love story, if you want to call that. A very young teenage girl, Hannah Mae Rhoden, age 13 at the time, was at the Pike County Fairgrounds. She participated in 4-H, and she had bunnies, and somebody introduced her to Jacob, who was almost 18 at that time, and she kept asking him to look at her bunnies or pet her bunnies. Jake will tell you that he was annoyed initially, but then on a second chance meeting, they started dating, if you can date at age 13. That was in August of 2010. Reportedly, Jake gets permission from Chris Rhoden Sr. to date his daughter, his very young daughter. Chris Rhoden agrees, but he always sends along a chaperone, either Frankie or little Chris, go with Hannah Mae whenever she's hanging out with Jake Rhoden. And you will learn as well that Chris Rhoden Sr. also knew Billy Wagner. They were in fact friends. And so because of that, he gave his permission for her to be dating Jake. A few years later, Jake asked Chris Rhoden Sr.'s permission to propose to his daughter. Chris Rhoden permitted the proposal, but informed Jake that he would not permit his daughter to marry anybody until she was 18 years of age. So they had an engagement where they tattooed wedding rings on themselves. And then you will learn that Hannah Mae got pregnant when she was 15 years of age. And at that time, Jake was 20 years of age. It was during the pregnancy that we see the first signs of trouble. There are text messages from Jake to Hannah Mae, which state that she has to make a decision whether to be with him or not, whether to live with him or not, that Sophia, they had already named their child, was going to live with him no matter what. So if she wanted to be with Sophia, she would have to come and stay with him. And he says, quote, "I'll take Sophie, and if I have to, by force." This is when Sophia was still inside of Hannah Mae's womb. She gave birth to Sophia in November of 2013. She did stay with the Wagners periodically up on Bethel Hill Road. If you recall, we went up to Bethel Hill Road during the jury view. That was the hill that we literally went up. That was, I think, day 2 of our jury view. We went up the hill. Once you got up there, there was a trailer. That trailer was not there previously. That's now a hunting cabin. But we asked you to look first to the left of that trailer out in the distance, and there was some structure there. That was the home that they lived in at the time. As a side note, on the way down from Bethel Hill, we had you look off to the right. You stayed on the bus, and we had you look generally in a location. That was the location of the first residence of the Wagners, which you will learn burned down. Ultimately, the Wagners moved to Peterson Road, 260 Peterson Road. That was the location. It was a red house. It had a pool, a standing pool outside. It had 2 barns we had you go through. We had you look at a well. We had you look at a cistern inside one of the barns, if you recall that. That pool was not there when the Wagners lived there. That's something that the new owners have improved on the property. Likewise, there was, I think, a deck on the cabin right by the pool that they had put on. So there were some things that were different. But for the most part, structurally, it was the same. So Hannah Mae lived with Jake and George and Angela at 260 Peterson Road. You will learn that when they were on Bethel Hill, Billy lived with them. But once they moved to Peterson Road, it was only Jake and George and Angela Wagner. And Tabitha Wagner, who was George's spouse, they got married in 2012. And she lived there, as well as Hannah Mae would stay there sometimes. Sometimes she would go home to her family. Eventually, Hannah Mae leaves Jake in early 2015. She calls her father, asks for him to come get her. Jake had choked her, and she just could not handle the controlling nature of not just Jake, but also the family. You will learn that she found difficulty because Angela Wagner, or Jake wanted Angela Wagner to really parent Sophia Wagner. And she said it was awkward because they would want her, Sophia, to call Angela mom, even when Hannah Mae was sitting right there. So again, just this kind of controlling. There was fat shaming, trying to keep her from her family. And you will see that they also did these sorts of things to Tabitha Wagner and later to the wife of Jake Wagner. Once Hannah Mae left Jake, she started dating somebody named Charlie Gilley, who was the brother of Hannah Hazel Gilley. You will learn that she did not date him for long because he had a drug habit, and she was not tolerant of that. And so she stopped dating him. She started dating another individual named Corey Holdren. After she started dating Corey Holdren, she learned that she was pregnant. And she knew that the child belonged to Charlie Gilley, just based on the timing and everything. She let Corey Holdren know that, and you will hear from him that he elected to stay with her because they had a very loving and supportive relationship. In fact, he will tell you that he had an addiction to pills that Hannah Mae helped him get over. She insisted that he not use drugs if they were going to remain together, and she stayed with him during the period of time that he was withdrawing from those drugs. So at this point, Jake is continuously trying to get Hannah Mae to come back to him, threatening to keep Sophia from her, and goes to see an attorney for custody. And you will learn that Hannah Mae goes to that attorney, even though it's Jake's attorney, and she knows that, and meets with them. But you will learn from that attorney that Hannah Mae was not interested in signing any custody paperwork. She wanted things to just remain status quo. She would ask for changes, they would make it, but she still would refuse to sign the papers. And ultimately, when they learned that she was pregnant, they decided to put that to the side. And again, that was in late 2015. So at this point, I'm going to bring in Tabitha Wagner, which is George Wagner's former wife, because she plays an important role in this story. She was living with the Wagners at the same time that Hannah Mae was. And you will learn that they engaged in the same cycle with Tabitha. She was not allowed to have contact with her family. She will tell you she had over a year where she had no contact with her family. And that was because the Wagners did not think her family were good people. There had been some abuse in the past, and they didn't want her even associating with her family. She will tell you that she was allowed to call her mother one time on her birthday, but they would stand there while she was making that phone call. They would accuse her of poisoning them with food. The Wagners would accuse Tabitha of doing that. They would accuse her of being abusive of Bullvine, which was the child that she and George Wagner had. And again, were very critical of her, criticized her on how she parented, and heralded Angela as the role model to emulate. And again, Angela was basically parenting Bullvine instead of allowing Tabitha to do that. You will learn that on one occasion, George and Tabitha got into an argument over Bullvine, and Tabitha said that she was going to take Bullvine and leave with him. Angela took Bullvine from her and made the comment that she was going to go get her gun. Angela said that. Tabitha fled from the residence. You will learn that Angela threw a 2x4 at her as she was exiting the residence. And Tabitha hid on the property until it was dark. And then she took a bicycle, and she bicycled down to the gas station, the nearest gas station, which was at least a mile away. Simultaneously, the Wagners go out looking for her. And when they see her arrive at the gas station, they are worried that she's going to call the police and say that they threatened her and they, threw a 2x4 at her, etc. She was just calling her mom for help. When that's what she did. She called her mom. But the Wagners, anticipating that she might be calling for law enforcement, the comment was made that whoever calls first is the one who gets the charges. You better call first, George, and report domestic violence against her, so that counteracts that. So that's what they did. And since there was 3 of them against one of Tabitha, a complaint was filed against Tabitha, even though she had not done anything to them. Then you will find out that there was a custody hearing, there was a dissolution of their marriage and custody hearing on Bullvine, and she was not represented. Tabitha was unrepresented. George had an attorney, And she entered into one of the historically worst custody agreements anyone's ever seen. Specifically, she had no rights to him. George had full custody, and she was permitted to see him only when the Wagner said so, and only supervised when they said so. So no set schedule for her to see this child, and only if and when the Wagner said so. She will tell you that they convinced her that this was just a temporary thing, that until she was able to get her own place and be on her own 2 feet, that this was just a temporary thing. However, when she got on her own 2 feet, and tried to get increase in visitation, they did not permit it. So she had to get an attorney. Again, this was in 2015, which becomes a very important time period. I know I'm kind of bouncing around here, but this takes us back to Hannah Mae when she was talking to Tabitha's mother. Okay, Tabitha's mother is named Tess, Patricia, but she goes by Tess. She is having a private Facebook conversation. So, you know, the messenger, and I don't know how many of you know Facebook, but, you know, you can post stuff on your Facebook and everybody can read it, or you can instant message somebody, you know, message them privately, and nobody else can see that conversation except you and the person you're conversing with, right? But they are talking about the Wagners and the custody issues that Jake and Hannah Mae are having, and Tess, Tabitha's mother, says to Hannah Mae, just make sure you don't let them make you sign papers like they did to Tabitha, right? To which Hannah Mae responds, I won't sign papers ever. They'll have to kill me first, okay? Again, that's a private message between Hannah Mae and Tabitha's mother. That conversation happened on December 9th of 2015. She had left Jake early in 2015. That conversation happens December 9th of 2015, after they had already kind of exhausted the whole attorney thing. Just over 4 months later, Hannah Mae and 7 members of her family are dead. So let's go back to April 21st and April 22nd when these homicides occurred, and how we ended up here today in the courtroom with this defendant. You will learn that Bobby Jo Manley, I mentioned her earlier, she's the sister of Dana Rhoden. She was there coming to the property of Chris Rhoden Sr. to feed the animals that he had. He had numerous dogs. They had chickens, they had pigs, they had inside dogs, outside dogs. So she was there to do this, and she typically would get her daughter on the bus at 7 a.m. and arrive at Chris Sr.'s house around 7:30 a.m. when she went. She didn't go every day. She sometimes went with an individual named Billy Morgan. Billy Morgan and Emma Morgan were a married couple that lived with Billy Jo Manley at that time, or Bobby Jo Manley, sorry. And sometimes Billy Morgan would go with Bobby Jo, and again, he would help her feed the animals, or he would mow the lawns and stuff. And they would keep track of their hours. There was a log inside Chris Sr.'s house where they would write down, you know, Bobby Jo or Billy, and you know, just that they were there. And then they got $20 a day to do these chores for Chris Sr. You will learn that typically Chris Sr. is not there when they arrive, because he gets up early and he's already on his way to Big Bear Lake where he works. So he's typically not there when they get there. Additionally, there are 2 dogs that are inside dogs, and they can only be let out one at a time. Otherwise, they fight and or run away. So Anytime they let one of those inside dogs out, it's just one at a time. Well, Bobby Joe will tell you that on this particular morning, she and Billy and Emma Morgan drove up to that location. Emma Morgan doesn't normally go with them, but they were going to go into town after the chores were done at Chris Sr.'s house, so she was just kind of tagging along for the ride. When they got there, you will learn that they immediately thought something was amiss because Chris Sr.'s truck was still at the house. And both of the inside dogs were sitting outside of the house on the front porch. Billy went to go start feeding the animals. Bobby Joe goes up to the house to see what's going on with Chris, why the dogs are out, all that stuff. The door is locked. That's also unusual. The door is not usually locked. She knows where the key is, though. She can't reach it. It's in a gutter above the front door. She calls Billy over to help her because he's taller, and they retrieve the key and they enter the residence. They obviously were not prepared for what they saw when they entered that residence. Furniture was askew. You'll hear there was vice grips on the floor that normally are in Chris Sr.'s pocket. And there was blood, lots and lots of blood. And drag marks leading from the living room through the kitchen and down the hall and back to the bedroom, where they surmised somebody who was bleeding had been drugged. They walk back to the bedroom, which is Chris Sr.'s bedroom, and there they find both Chris Sr. and Gary Rhoden laying on the floor. Bobby Joe could not tell what kind of injuries they had. She could not tell that they were shot. She thought that they had been beaten to death just because of so much blood, and they were partially covered with a comforter. She tried to rouse them by shouting at them. Billy was behind her. They quickly exited, and she went to the car where Emma Morgan, they call her Emmy, was still seated, and she retrieved her telephone and made a phone call to 911. And you will be able to hear that 911 call. She's out of breath. She's clearly frantic, clearly upset. Everyone who came into contact with her after that point will describe her as that. After she calls 911, she will tell you, it sticks vividly in her head, that she couldn't remember the address of Chris Sr., so she had to walk out to the mailbox to get the address for the dispatcher. She gets that address and gives it to the dispatcher, and in the meantime, she decides she's going to walk to Frankie's house to get his help and let him know what's happened to his father and to Gary. So she walks basically that same path that we walked on our jury view, and she gets to Frankie's house, and she's knocking on the door and yelling for Frankie, and she's not getting an answer. She hears Brentley, the 3-year-old, answer from behind the door, and she says, "Hey, B," is what she called him, "it's Aunt JoJo. Can you open the door?" He opens the door for her. There's a chain lock that she recalls having to help get open, and she enters the residence and asks Brentley where his father is. And Brentley points down the hallway and says, "Daddy has a lot of blood." She goes down to the bedroom, which is to the right when you enter the residence, and she finds both Frankie and Hannah Hazel laying in bed, clearly dead. Hannah Hazel apparently had been nursing Ruger at the time of her death because of the way the clothing was situated, and Ruger was still laying between them, covered in his parents' blood. Bobby Joe takes Ruger out of the bed. She says she couldn't help it. She didn't want him laying in their blood any longer. She gets both Ruger and Brentley, and she exits the residence. You will also learn that while she was walking to Frankie's house, Billy Morgan had gotten in the vehicle that they had arrived in and gone to get Dana Rhoden and Leonard and Judy Manley, who are the parents of Dana Rhoden and the parents of Bobby Joe Manley. Billy stopped at Dana's house, yelled for Dana, didn't get an answer, noticed the door was ajar, but decided to go on to Leonard and Judy's and get their help, and let them know what had happened to everybody. Leonard and Judy follow Billy Morgan back up to Frankie's house, and they also enter that residence, and along with James Manley. James Manley, again, is the brother of Dana Rhoden and the brother of Dana Rhoden and Bobby Joe Manley. He had not heard what had happened, but he saw Billy Morgan come to his parents' house and seemingly frantic, and his parents then rushing out afterwards and following Billy Morgan, and so he decided to get in his truck and follow and see what was wrong as well. When he saw what had happened to Frankie and Hazel, and Bobby Joe also told him then what had happened to Chris Sr. and Gary Rhoden, James decided to go down and tell his sister what has happened to her son and her former husband. When he gets there, he also notices that the door is ajar. He enters the residence. He knew that his sister had worked a double shift. They live very close to one another. The Manleys, Leonard and Judy Manley, live very close to where Dana Rhoden lived with Hannah Mae and Christopher. And he thought that maybe she was just sleeping, that she was, just really tired because she had worked a double shift and had worked late. He went back to her bedroom. She was covered up, so he didn't know if she was in the bed. He felt around in the bed until he could feel that her body was there, and he lifted the pillow that was covering her face and said that he could tell it was sticking to her face, and so he let it drop back down, knew that she was dead, and exited the residence. He will tell you that he heard Kylie, the 5-day-old baby, crying, but he could not bring himself to go back and see anything more. He went out, got into his truck, went and got his wife, April Manley, to tell her everything that he had seen and learned. And she came back with him to Dana's residence. And this was the residence, this was the last residence we visited on the first day. It had a red garage still standing. It kind of had, you could tell there was a cellar because this residence had an addition built onto it, and there was actually a cellar down there. It was right before we went on lunch break, the first day. April and James were there then at that residence, and in the meantime, law enforcement is finally responding, right? I should have mentioned that when Bobby Joe and them came out of the residence at Frankie's, the first deputy arrived on scene, Deputy Chandler, and several others followed him, and they were interested in getting anybody out of the scenes, roping off the scenes, protecting the scenes. Likewise, there were law enforcement coming up past Dana's up to Chris and Frankie's, as opposed to the first people to arrive came this way. They were going to Chris Sr.'s, but they had to pass by Frankie's, and that's when they saw all these individuals collected outside of Frankie's residence. James Manley and April Manley flagged down the first law enforcement people that they saw passing the house. Those law enforcement, again, on their way to Chris Sr.'s house, not knowing that there was more individuals who had been killed at that location. And they told them what was going on, that they had gone in and they believed Dana Rhoden to be dead, that they heard the baby crying, but they had not checked on any of the other individuals, that there should at least be Hannah Mae and little Chris in that residence. Officers started to try to clear the residence because nobody at this time knows if there's an active threat present in any of these residences. So they're trying to clear it. Another deputy comes in and is focused on retrieving the baby, goes back to Hannah Mae's bedroom and gets Kylie and goes out of the residence with Kylie in his arms. Gives Kylie to an EMT, who then takes Kylie to an ambulance, and April Manley was permitted to be with Kylie while they were dealing with the scene. You will learn that the first room that they cleared when they were clearing the residence was little Chris's room. Again, that was off to the right, and you will see pictures of this, but when you enter the residence, his bedroom was off to the right. There was a living room that you're standing in when you enter the front door. There's a kitchen, and then there's Dana's bedroom, a hallway, and Hannah Mae's bedroom was back in the addition. So he was separated, by a living room and a kitchen from his mother and sister. They found little Chris in bed, shot and dead, and then they work their way back to Hannah Mae's bedroom and see that she also is shot and dead. And then they go to Dana's bedroom and confirm that she also has been shot and is dead. They clear the scene, and then you'll learn that, as with all these scenes, they rope it off and they prevent anybody else from going in until BCI can arrive and process the scene for evidence, right? So you will learn that then Sheriff Reeder showed up around 9:30. The phone call to 911 was just before 8 a.m. And you will learn that when he arrived, he kind of got a briefing of what was going on, kind of gathered facts and information, made sure the scenes were secure, asked EMT. There was a number of ambulances that had arrived by that time. He asked them to stage at a location that was between Chris Sr.'s house and Dana Rhoden's house. And he made a decision to call BCI to come and process the scenes, and then later to handle the investigation. BCI often helps process scenes for communities that don't have their own crime scene units, but especially in a case of this magnitude, Sheriff Reeder was going to do that. He also called the coroner and did his administrative stuff, right? Made sure that everybody was organized. He called other sheriff's deputies that ultimately came to help secure the scenes, do roadblocks so that people couldn't come in and out of the scenes, etc. The family of these people that were killed, of course, families calling family and everybody's being notified. They called Chelsea to come and get Brentley. She came and got Brentley. Kylie and Ruger were both transported to Adams County Regional Hospital just to be checked. And the family members of these individuals who were killed also started arriving on scene just to get some information or confirmation, or frankly to be told that this wasn't happening. The sheriffs made a decision to relocate all of the victims' family to a church on Union Hill Road. It's across 32 on the other side of Union Hill Road. And there they could, both the investigators could interact with the family and get any necessary information from them, and also the victims' families could receive information from law enforcement. You will also learn that during this time, family members had been calling Kenneth Rhoden, our last victim, out at Left Fork Road. But because he works in Columbus and they know his habit is to not really check his messages until lunch hour, he doesn't have his phone on his person. He goes out to his vehicle over lunch, and they expected that once the lunch hour came, he would check his messages and certainly return the many phone calls that he had received. However, he did not. And so some of the individuals that were at the church decided that they would go to Kenneth's house again to let him know what was happening. Where he's at Left Fork Road doesn't always have good cell phone service. Even he doesn't have good cell phone service out there. So they were hoping that that maybe was the explanation for why he was not receiving or returning phone calls. Donald Stone, Luke Rhoden, who is Kenneth's son, and Sean Watson, all three traveled out to that location. When they got there, again, called out for his dad. His dad didn't answer. Donald volunteered to go into the residence first, so Luke didn't have to. And they found Kenneth Rhoden also shot in bed where he had been laying sleeping. So they exited the residence and called 911, and local law enforcement responded to that. And again, same process of roping off the scenes and waiting for BCI to arrive. And BCI, we always assume people know our acronyms. That's the Bureau of Criminal Investigations. It's a part of the Attorney General's office at the time. It was Mike DeWine. BCI arrived. You'll learn from Sheriff Evans that in his time there, again, he was interested in securing the residences. He also was responsible for getting the search warrants so that BCI could, in fact, search the residences of these 4 crime scenes. He would let you know that approximately 1:30 in the afternoon is when they finally got their search warrants typed, approved, and back out to the scenes and delivered to the BCI agents that were already there, waiting for the search warrant so they could begin processing the scenes. So, and you'll also learn, I guess I should add this now too, that the coroners here don't do the autopsies, but they do respond when there's any unnatural death, just responsible for kind of a cursory review and in reaching a cursory cause of death. So the coroners that were responsible for this case was Dr. Kessler, who is the Pike County coroner, Dr. Farranet, who is a deputy coroner, and then an individual named Kenneth Dick from Adams County. He also helped. Again, kind of the call went out for as many people as possible to help on this. And there was actually a dispute as to whether this was Adams County or Pike County, and you will learn that the sheriff of Adams County and the sheriff of Pike County met and discussed, and the sheriff of Adams County was very certain that this was in Pike County. Apparently there are maps actually that show it both ways, so that's still kind of in dispute, but just as an aside. Okay, so again, you will hear from each of the crime scene individuals, the crime scene agents who process the scene. There was usually one main one, and then usually another individual that would help that individual process the scene. They first start taking photographs of outside, and they work their way inside. They take pictures of everything as they find it before disturbing anything. And then they go back and start looking where there's evidence and putting down markers that mark that evidence and collecting, blood swabs or ballistics or anything that they find. So let's talk about what we found at the crime scenes. At crime scene 1, where Chris Sr. and Gary Rhoden were, they recovered one .40 caliber shell casing, and they also, the following day, recovered a fully jacketed ammo from underneath the floor, and that was a heavier weight .30 caliber ammo. And you will hear from Matt White that he believed that to be probably a 7.69 .32 ammo, but he didn't know for sure because there wasn't enough of it left to tell that. That was from scene 1. Additionally, in scene 1, there were shoe prints that were collected. You will learn that, well, because there was so much blood at that scene, there were shoe prints that were left there, and those were collected. They literally just cut up that part of the floor and submitted it to the lab for processing, where you will hear from the BCI expert who processes that stuff, that she was able to get 2 very good shoe prints for comparison. What they do from that point is they try to ascertain what shoe this is, right? So there's databanks that BCI has, databanks that FBI has, but she was not able to find that in any of the databanks that were present. So she went out herself to various shoe stores and places that sell shoes, and trying to find something that matched that shoe print, the tread and design. And she was actually able to find that shoe at Walmart. It was a men's shoe, Velcro, and she was able to tell that it was either a 10.5 or an 11. You will later learn that she was only focused on one shoe print. When she actually looked at both, she discovered that there was a 10.5 and an 11 size shoe print in that residence. So a 10.5 and a size 11 of the same shoe, same type of shoe, just different sizes in the same shoe. So she was able to glean that from scene 1. And I should note, I didn't tell you this before, but after everything was secured at the scenes, the Bobby Joe Manley, Billy Morgan, Emmy Morgan, and James Manley, all individuals who first discovered the deceased individuals, were taken to the sheriff's office and interviewed. That's traditional. If you're the first person that discovers something, you're going to be interviewed. They also took their shoes, or in James Manley's case, took pictures of the shoes because he did not want to part with his boots. So we know that the shoe does not belong to any of those individuals. Okay, so that was the reason for doing that, is because they very quickly realized that there was this shoe print evidence. You will hear from Matt White that the .40 caliber shell casing that was left at Chris Sr.'s residence, he believed it to belong to a Glock, and he believed it to be a 3rd or 4th generation Glock. He also, there was a shell casing at .40 caliber recovered from Kenneth Rhoden's address as well. Just, he was only shot one time, and the shell casing was still there, and those two matched. And when I say they matched, I don't mean they're just the same type of ammo. I mean they were fired from the same gun, okay? They can tell by the impressions that are made when the bullet is fired through the gun. So they were able to tell that Chris Rhoden Sr., Gary Rhoden, and Kenneth Rhoden were all shot by the same .40 caliber Glock. As to Frankie and Hannah Hazel, and Dana and Hannah Mae and little Chris, they found 22 shell casings, 22 caliber shell casings, rimfire shell casings, at both Frankie's, laying in the bed. Especially when they removed the body, they were able to find all these shell casings. There were 5 at Frankie and Hannah Hazel's, and there was only 1 single shell casing found at the residence where Dana and Hannah and little Chris lived, and that was underneath the crib in the room where Hannah Mae slept. But they were able to match those. Those also were, so we learned that Frankie and Hannah Hazel, Dana, Hannah Mae, and little Chris were all killed with the same weapon. Now, Matt White was less sure about what type of .22 weapon that was, because he had never seen the markings. The markings were very unique. So he reached out to a lot of professional organizations trying to find out. Ultimately, Bowling Green's BCI lab ran across a gun that was a Colt 1911-22 long rifle that made a very similar impression on the shell casing. So Matt White compared those, and he said, yes, this is the same type of weapon. So he became certain, not the identical weapon, not the weapon, but the same type of weapon, because he talked to people in Germany who confirmed for him that Colt made that weapon, and the firing pin made a very unique, that very unique marking on the shell casing. So he was convinced that we were looking for a 1911-22 long rifle. So they also determined, based on the ammo and the injuries to Chris Rhoden Sr., he was shot. Again, he and Gary were the only two who were fully dressed and awake when this happened. You could tell that he had been standing in front of the doorway when he was first shot. He had wood embedded in his face and his head, and they could tell it was a high-powered rifle, like an AR or an SKS, and that would fit with the ammo that they found as well. So we're kind of just narrowing down what guns we're looking for and that sort of thing. Through ballistic evidence, Matt White is our firearms expert at BCI, and we now know that there were 3 weapons involved in the killing of these 8 individuals. The autopsies also confirmed those findings. The coroner will tell you, and the coroner is Dr. Lohman from Hamilton County Coroner's Office. She will tell you that the injuries she saw were consistent on the 5 that we believe were killed with the .22 of a smaller caliber weapon. She definitely felt that it had to be a high-powered rifle that Chris Sr. got shot in his arm because it tore through his muscle and caused fractures of his arm. And that the .40 caliber, you know, the injuries were consistent with the .40 caliber being on Kenneth, Chris Sr., and Gary Rhoden. So basically, Chris Rhoden Sr. was shot with 2 different weapons, a high-powered rifle and a .40 Glock. They were also able to tell the angle by which, from where the high-powered rifle was shot, and they do that based on the angles of the holes and stuff, and again, you'll hear from the crime scene agents that were responsible for doing that. They could tell that it had been from outside of the residence and that it was someone who was positioned down from where he was shot. And again, you'll get to see those angles. Another shoe print was found in scene 3 with the identical shoe that our shoe print expert had found at Walmart. It was the size 11. They were able to ascertain that, and you will hear a very detailed explanation of that. It's actually quite intriguing if you've never really thought about the bottom of your shoe before. But there's different stippling or impressions that they make on the bottom of the shoe so that no size is going to be the same, right? So the design on it, there's several differences, but you'll be able to see it with your own 2 eyes, that there's definite distinguishable differences. You will hear not only from Suzanne Elliott, who is the BCI expert in shoe print analysis, but also from an individual named William Bodziak, who is kind of considered the grandfather of shoe print evidence. He's been doing it for decades. He used to work for the FBI, has been referred to by the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, as one of the 2 world-renowned experts in the field of shoe print evidence. So it was important enough evidence that that stuff got sent to him to analyze as well. And he confirms everything that Suzanne Elliott determined, which is that there was a size 10.5 and a size 11 of this particular shoe inside scene 1, and a size 11 of the same shoe inside scene 3. Scene 3 being Dana Rhoden and Hannah Mae and Christopher Rhoden Sr., sorry. We kind of number those just based on how they were discovered, right? Chris Sr.'s house was discovered first, Frankie's was second, Dana's was third, and then Kenneth's was fourth. So sometimes you'll hear individuals talking, their witnesses talking about it in that way. The other thing that people deduced from the processing the scenes and looking at the evidence was that there was likely a silencer or suppressor used, especially when you're talking about with Frankie and Hannah and Dana and Hannah Mae and Chris Rhoden, little Chris, because they did not wake up. It did not appear that they woke up when the first individual was shot. So that would lead one to believe that probably a suppressor or silencer was used. So they kind of, again, this is just things that we're deducing based on the evidence and going forward in the investigation for. The other thing that the investigators felt strongly about was that whoever killed these individuals were very intimate with both the personal habits of the Rhodens and the residences themselves. The reason they said that, again, I told you that Dana Rhoden and Hannah Mae and little Chris had just moved into that residence less than 30 days prior. So you had to know them well enough to know that, right? This kind of gets rid of the drug cartel idea, and other individuals who just wouldn't know that, right? But they also knew of the surveillance cameras, et cetera, that were located at each of these places. Now, they weren't located at each of these places. Chris Sr.'s house had cameras, and Kenneth had cameras. Those were removed. So whoever killed these people knew that, right? So again, that's what the initial just processing of the crime scene indicated to investigators. In the meantime, of course, we're getting thousands of tips. Thousands is an exaggeration. We had more than 1,000 tips. Doing multiple, everybody's going in all directions. Immediately, there was information that the Rhodens had been in an argument with a group of individuals, and that group of individuals had threatened them on Facebook. And then one of those individuals actually took credit for it after the homicides and claimed that they had committed the homicides. That individual was found and interviewed, and that story quickly fizzled. So it was not those individuals. But, the investigators considered everybody, right? We talked about, I guess, the building that you saw there, where we had you look up the stairs, that would have been right beside the residence, had a marijuana grow in it at Chris Sr.'s location. And there was a smaller version of that at Kenneth's. So, of course, the investigators ran down, and every lead, related to anybody any of these individuals would have dealings with. We also did tower dumps. Tower dumps just tell you what phones are hitting off what towers at that time of the homicides. And you just kind of trap and preserve that information. Back to the shoe print stuff, we knew that that was a Walmart shoe. We knew what kind of Walmart shoe it was. And so we got video footage of all Walmart, anybody who purchased a size 10.5 or 11 in between the months of January 2016 and April 2016 in a 50-mile radius of the crime scene. So lots of Walmarts that we got video footage from, that anybody who purchased that, because we knew that those shoes belonged to the people who killed these individuals. Another thing that we could tell about the shoes was that they were new. Immediately upon examination of the prints that were left at the scene, our expert was able to tell us that that was either never worn or nearly never worn. So we were looking, that's why we only asked for that kind of time frame, right? So a lot was, we were able to learn just from the physical evidence, at least as far as what we were looking for. So what finally turned our attention to the Wagners? When Jake Wagner was initially interviewed, pretty early in the investigation, he indicated that everything was just dandy between he and Hannah Mae. And it wasn't until we got back those Facebook records and some of the text messaging that we found that that was not the case, right? So we're seeing these messages where she's saying that. So that contradicted what he was saying. She was confronting him about being violent. We also saw that, the message between Tabitha's mom. Additionally, Billy Wagner was interviewed, and he indicated that we were asking everybody for their phones just to, because they had interactions with the victims. We wanted to get their phones just to kind of see if we could piece anything together. And he indicated that he did not have the phone that he had at the time of the homicides because he kept trying to call Chris Sr. because Chris Sr. was his best friend, and after the homicides, he kept trying to call him, and he finally got frustrated and upset one day and broke his phone. Well, that was a good story, but it wasn't true because we have phone records that indicate he never once tried to call Chris Sr. And in fact, we had the phone calls to Billy Wagner at that 10:55 p.m. that was never returned by Billy Wagner. So that didn't add up. Additionally, there was a story that Billy Wagner put out, what we would call a false exculpatory story, which was that Billy and Chris were supposed to do some big drug deal out in California for upwards of $800,000, and that Skid Montgomery, who supposedly would want in on that, found out, and Skid Montgomery's the one who killed Chris Rhoden, and that Billy was probably next. That didn't make any sense either, because obviously Billy was not dead, and nor was he hiding at that time. So again, just kind of little things like that was enough for us to look a little bit harder at the Wagners. And the real question was, we knew that Hannah had told Tabitha's mom that she would not sign papers ever, that they would have to kill her first. But did the Wagners know that? And if they did know that, was that enough motive for them to kill the Rhodens? And the answer to both questions, unfortunately, is yes. They did know about the message, and yes, that was sufficient motive for them to kill Hannah Mae and her family. After we started focusing on the Wagners, we knew we needed to do some search warrants. Jake Wagner had been playing kind of dodge the ball with Special Agent Scheiderer as far as turning over his phone as well. He still had a phone, but he was not turning it over to us. So we decided we needed to get a search warrant for that phone to collect it from Jake Wagner. So upon serving that search warrant to Jake Wagner and getting his phone, this was right before they went to Alaska. They went to Alaska in May of 2017, and we obviously had been turning the heat up on them, and they could tell that. I just indicated that Special Agent Scheiderer had been trying to get the phone from Jake and had been unable to do so. While he was there serving the search warrant for the phone upon Jake at 260 Peterson Road, Special Agent Scheiderer noticed shell casings, lots and lots of shell casings in the driveway. Now, again, 260 Peterson Road, when you walk up to the old barn, and then when you're kind of parallel to it, that's where he saw a lot of the shell casings. And we decided to get a search warrant for those, to collect those, in the event that any of them were the same or similar to what had been used at the crime scene. So we went out and executed that search warrant on the day that the Wagners actually left to go to Alaska, and found a shell casing that Matt White said was a match to the .22 caliber shell casings that were recovered from the crime scenes at Frankie's house and at Dana's house, as in fired from the same weapon, not just similar, but the actual gun that killed Dana and Hannah and little Chris, and Frankie and Hannah Hazel had also been fired out at 260 Peterson Road. We returned the following day with more agents and the STAR team, and combed the area looking for any other shell casings. These shell casings were clearly weathered. They weren't recent. We ended up with, I believe, 12 shell casings that were compared. There were many more, but there were 12 that were compared by Matt White to the 5 shell casings that we had from, or 6, sorry, from the crime scenes, and they were direct matches. So now we knew that one of the Wagners, or someone that had shot the weapon out at the Wagners, had also shot and killed at least 5 of our victims. The conclusions that Matt White made was these comparisons revealed matching individual firing pin impression characteristics, confirming the 18 fired .22 rimfire cartridge cases were fired in the same firearm. But something else happened that day as well. We were approached by a neighbor, and the neighbor told us that the Wagners had put all their belongings in some trailers, and they had parked the trailers up off of State Route 41, which we went to as well. That was the place where we kind of drove down a side road, and we had to look through a yard. It was the very last thing we did, I think, on the second day of jury view. And you looked back towards a white big house and just vast property, basically. So having learned that, we first confirmed that there were, in fact, trailers up there. And then we went and got a search warrant in order to search those trailers. And you will see pictures of this. It is truly a needle in a haystack. But there were several trailers, and in searching, literally took everything off of the trailers and searched through them. There was a tub of important things. It was labeled that. And inside that tub was a receipt. A receipt dated April 7th, I believe. Yes, April 7th of 2016 for 2 pairs of athletic shoes from Walmart. So just 2 weeks prior to the homicides, we have a receipt in the Wagner's property of someone purchasing the shoes. We don't know yet if they're the shoes, right? But we definitely are going to check this out. We do that. We send an agent to Walmart with the receipt so that he can get the, find out from Walmart what shoe this is based on the SKU numbers or whatever. And simultaneously, we send a CIU individual to our command post, which was out at the A plant, to pull up the video footage, that bank of video footage that we had, if you recall, that we collected from Walmart but didn't have a use for yet. And we were able to pull up the video from Waverly Walmart on that same date, at the same time of that receipt, and Angela Wagner was in Walmart purchasing a 10.5 and an 11 size in the identical shoe that was left at the crime scene. Meantime, our special agent was able to confirm with Walmart that it was in fact a 10.5 and an 11 of that shoe. So that was a very important find. The other thing that we found was a typed up list of demands for Hannah Mae regarding Sophia, about who was allowed to watch her, who wasn't allowed to watch her, how she would be schooled, she would be homeschooled, you know, all these other things that she had to abide by, that was typed up by Jake Wagner. Another discovery at the time were custody documents. And by custody documents, I mean documents that one would fill out so that if anything happened to you, your children would go to somebody, right? So there were documents that purported to be signed by Hannah Mae that said, if I die, I want my child to go to Jake Wagner. I want my child, Sophia Wagner, to go to Jake Wagner, the person that I, you know, have such issues with. That piece of paper was dated as if Hannah Mae had signed it in December, on December 24th of 2014, Christmas Eve, 2014, which was really the last holiday that she spent with the Wagners, right? Because she left in early 2015. And the problem with that, first of all, was that our handwriting people looked at it and said that Hannah Mae likely did not sign that thing. We had a very recent signature of hers when she applied for a driver's license and compared it to the signature that was on there. But more importantly, let me see if I can fly through this and get you to it. Sorry. More importantly, you're right, if your eyes can see this, then good for you. It was printed off the computer on April 3rd of 2016. That piece of paper didn't even exist until April 3rd of 2016, so it could not have been filled out in December of 2014. You will also learn that, well, I won't get ahead of myself. But, so we knew that that had been backdated, right? We knew that she could not have signed that in 2014 because the paper didn't even exist until 2016. And again, April 3rd of 2016, just a little over 2 weeks before the homicides, they're printing this out so that if Hannah Mae would unexpectedly meet the end, Sophia would go to Jake. But there were two other documents that we found on that day, which are extremely telling. There were two documents, one that Jake filled out and one that George filled out. And they were dated, I believe, in 2015, March of 2015, instead of December of 2014. But they said, for Jake's, if he dies, Sophia goes to Angela Wagner, not Hannah Mae. Almost like they knew Hannah Mae wasn't going to be alive. That's one. George Wagner also fills out a custody document that if something happens to him on the night of the murders, Bullvine, his child, will go to his mother. So they were anticipating whether they got arrested, caught in the middle of the act, or something worse. They wanted to make sure that custody of their children was secure. on April 3rd of 2016, all 3 of those documents were printed out and filled out and signed. And you will learn that as well from further evidence. We also found other things like a brass catcher and a bug detector and other items that were of obvious interest. That led us to wanting to have conversations with the Wagners and confronting them with this information, right? So we went to the border in Montana because they had traveled to Alaska. They drove to Alaska, and they drove through Canada. They actually left through North Dakota, but when they came back through Sweetgrass, Montana. And so we went up there and confronted them, and most telling of the things that we confronted to, you could tell they had a canned response for a lot of things. They knew that we had used metal detectors out at their house. So they had a response for that. Canned response, all said the same thing. But when confronted with the shoes, clearly not expecting that confrontation, Angela admitted to buying those shoes for her boys. However, she said that they hated the shoes because they were old grandpa shoes. Quite honestly, they are. And she threw them away the same day because she didn't like them. Never mind, she had the receipt. Now, I will say they were only like $13.97 per pair. But if you had taxes and 2 pair, that's $30. You could have easily gotten back if you just returned it. But she says those shoes couldn't have been used in the murders because she threw them away the same day she bought them for her boys because they hated them. And the video footage also showed that there were other individuals in that vehicle when she bought those shoes, and you will learn later that it was, in fact, Jake and George and the 2 children, young children as well. While the Wagners were at the border, we also installed a listening device in the vehicle that they were driving. So we touched on this in voir dire about citizens' right to privacy, certainly. But at this point, we had an overwhelming amount of evidence that was pointing us to the direction to believe that the Wagner family, Jake, George, Angela, and Billy, were involved in the murder of 8 individuals. We had to coordinate that with other states, and were able to do that. The most interesting thing about that device that was installed in the vehicle, so imagine, if you will, 4 individuals being surprised at a Montana border, agents putting them in separate rooms, and BCI walking in and questioning them. Ohio BCI people walking in and questioning them. First, Billy and Angela get back in the vehicle. First, Billy gets in the vehicle. He's released first, and then Angela gets in the vehicle. Not a word. Not a word about, oh my gosh, can you believe that happened? What they think we did this? No conversation like that at all. No conversation at all about what just happened. And then George comes out, and then Jake comes out, and then they're released and free to go. We find out later that there's a reason for that, because Billy had told them that, be quiet. There's a listening device. Other records are coming back as well. At the Montana border, we seized a laptop. It was in the possession of Angela Wagner, but we found that it was used by all of the Wagners. We had financial records that came back. We had phone records that came back, phone records from Jake's phone that we had got the search warrant for. Financial records revealed purchases of parts to make a homemade silencer. Sorry, completely out of order here. and going backwards. So, from February to March of 2016, you show purchases of 2 flashlights, drill bits, tap and die, freeze plugs that act as baffles. So this is just a open source video that shows you how to make a silencer out of a mag light. Mag lights has serial numbers. It's actually a way to make it if you can apply to ATF to make it. And that's why they have the serial number on the mag lights, is because for legitimate purposes. You see there in the upper right-hand corner is The Walking Dead. Used mag light silencers because if you kill a zombie and they hear, then the other zombies come. So, and you will learn that Jake was an avid Walking Dead watcher. So we show purchases of items to make a homemade silencer for both a .22 caliber weapon, you can tell based on the size of the drill bits and the tap and die, and a .40 or .30 caliber weapon. So, and again, you will hear from ATF about this. They will give you information about how you make a homemade silencer. We show 2 masks purchased by George on April 9th of 2016. We show Jake, at least his awards card being used to buy 7.62 ammo and a magazine for an SKS, also in April. There was a phone jammer purchased by Angela. A phone jammer jams signals for phones. So say you're gonna go murder 8 people and you don't want them to be able to call for help, then you have a phone jammer on your person and it jams the signals. It's actually illegal because it can interfere with aircraft and such. So, but that was purchased, and a bug detector was purchased by Angela. There were the financial records also just confirm what we already knew, which was this is a very, they function as one unit in pretty much everything they do. Financially is no exception. The house in Peterson Road was in both Jake and George's name. Angela lived there with them. They interchangeably used each other's credit cards and account, PayPal accounts or Amazon accounts or whatever. And we showed George buying fuel filters from OK Auto Parts on April 18th of 2016, and that will come into play later. Phone records revealed a list of guns that Jake had made, and the gun list includes an SKS belonging to George Wagner. It was a list of all the guns that the Wagners owned and who owned them, or who they belonged to, right? There was a little Cricket that belonged to Sophia. There was an SKS that belonged to George, and there was a 1911 .22 that belonged to Jake. So this was just a list that he had made in 2015 of phones that they just kind of a inventory of the phones that they did. We also learned that both Jake and George dyed their hair the week of the homicides, dyed it very dark. Now, again, this is kind of an oddity, but Jake Wagner fancied himself a Norman Reedus lookalike. Norman Reedus is the actor who plays Daryl on The Walking Dead. He also plays in another movie called Boondock Saints. You will hear more information about this in the course of the trial. So again, please follow the court's order and don't go home and watch it. Only consider what you hear here. But Boondock Saints is the story of 2 brothers who are vigilante killers, kill people we need killed, right? And they're justified, and they say scripture over the last guy right before they kill And their dad, in Boondock Saints 2, the dad also joins in. The two brothers, one of the brothers is played by Norman Reedus, okay? So this becomes important when, again, we're examining Jake's phone, and we find that at 7:06 p.m. on the night of the homicides, he Googles and watches a scene from Boondock Saints 2. It's called the Ding Dong Motherfucker scene, okay? It's not even one of the brothers in the scene, but he's got 1911 22s with silencers on them, and utter some profanities, like they're arriving to kill these people, right? They watched that at 7 o'clock the night before they left to go kill these 8 people. That's important because for whatever reason, they take a lot of their cues from the homemade silencer from The Walking Dead and dyed their hair to look like the brothers in Boondock Saints. And, of course, presumably to throw off any forensic evidence that might be gathered if they were to leave behind a hair. We also seized a laptop, I told you that. When we were able to finally look at that laptop, we found the answer to our question of, we knew that Hannah Mae had said, they will have to kill me first. But did the Wagners know that? And the laptop demonstrated that yes, in fact they did, because Tabitha Wagner in 2015, around about April of 2015, had started pushing for visitation of her son. And when she wasn't getting it, she consulted with an attorney, and she was following the attorney's instructions and trying to get like Wednesdays and every other weekend to start with. The Wagners weren't having that. And so Angela Wagner was hacking into the Facebook accounts of Tabitha and Tabitha's mother. And you will learn that at some point, they had insisted on getting that password from Tabitha. And apparently she had not changed it, or they remained logged in, or whatever enabled them to continue doing that. But the purpose for that hacking was to get dirt or information on Tabitha to use against her during any custody proceedings, if in fact she did initiate custody proceedings, right? So during this process of Angela hacking into this Facebook to gather stuff for George, in the event that Tabitha initiates this custody thing, they see this message between Hannah Mae and Tabitha's mom that was meant to be private, obviously, but they say that. The screenshot, so there's a screenshot of this, right? So that's how we knew that they were seeing it, because she would take screenshots because she was going to use that in court, right? The screenshot was practically real time. It was taken almost immediately after the messages occurred. So there was some active monitoring of that going on. And I have to say, note, probably the most important word in that is she says, I won't sign papers ever. They will have to kill me first. Not Jake will have to kill me first. They will have to kill me first. Because she knew how the Wagners operated. She talked about the fact of how they did Tabitha that night and how they were trying to lure her back into the house. And they had a gun on the coffee table. So she very much understood how the Wagners operated as a group. The last thing that we got from, probably not the last thing, but another significant thing that we got from the backup of Jake's phone on that laptop was a picture of him holding a 1911. Let's see if I can get us there. Nope, went the wrong way again. So you see in the upper left-hand corner, there's a picture of the 1911 on carpet, which was consistent with the carpet inside of 260 Peterson. And then there's a later photo of him holding the weapon. You can see the tattoo. And down there's just a close-up of the tattoo around his finger. You can see it in that first picture, close up. Additionally, they were able to take prints from the photo and compare it to known prints of Jake Wagner and confirm that it was in fact his hand. Now it was taken by his phone, so we assumed that anyhow, especially with all the other indications, but at that point, we believed we had the murder weapon, or at least one of the murder weapons in Jake's hand. Another thing, another investigative tool that we did was monitoring their phone conversations, both in 2017 and in 2018, both summers. 2017 being when they first went to Alaska, 2018 being when they came back from Alaska. We also installed listening devices in the truck that Jake and George drove together. They worked for R&L, and they did tandem driving. So while one was sleeping, the other was driving, or at least that was the theory. That's not really how it works, because they often were awake at the same time. Also, I forgot to mention that we had done a search warrant on the Flying W shortly after we did a search warrant on Peterson Road and then the 41 that led us to State Route 41. There we found 2 bulletproof vests in possession of Billy Wagner, and numerous weapons, I want to say 14, but numerous weapons that were not in Billy's room. He had asked Rhoden to keep them in her room in the event of something like a search warrant. She did acknowledge to us that they were his weapons. But what we noticed most in the 2017 time that we were monitoring their conversations was that they were constantly reminding each other not to talk on the phones and not to say anything because they're probably listening to us, or wait until you get home so we can talk about it. So it was clear that they were trying to thwart any efforts of listening to them. One of the most significant things that we heard in 2017, however, was when we brought ground penetrating radar machines in there to try to look for any buried weapons or cell phones or anything, because I neglected to mention that they took a lot of the victims' cell phones when they committed these homicides. Not Frankie and not Hazel, but everybody else, they took their phones. And while we were out there and we were listening to their conversations, Jake was having conversations with the new homeowner, because they had sold the property at 260 Peterson Road, and the new homeowner, who was still the current owner, that was his first day of possession when we came out there. And so Jake was talking to him saying, basically you can kick them off if you want to. And but Angela was asking Jake which barn, because they could tell we were searching it, for metal. And she kept saying, which barn though, Jake, which barn? And it was very important to her, you could tell, to just, to learn which barn we were searching. So that was one conversation that was very telling, and made us also wonder what was so important about a barn. In 2018, I think we had much more success listening to the conversations, and you will get to hear some of these conversations or hear the content of these conversations. But I think that is because we had kind of laid low for the year that they were in Alaska, and they didn't realize we were still doing stuff, because we hadn't been interacting with them. And so when we first kind of tuned in, we got a more organic conversations. But it was right back to kind of the same MO, which was George and Angela were scolding Jake because Jake had married a girl in Alaska, Beth Ann. He married her, and then she traveled with them back to Ohio. They had stopped briefly to try to get a home in Missouri, but the loan people weren't going to approve that. So they came back to Ohio and moved into the residence of Angela's father, who had passed while they were in Alaska. And so she inherited that home, so it was, free room and board. So, but Beth Ann had come back with them, and George and Angela were very upset with Jake because Jake had told Sophia that she could call Beth Ann Mom. And the reason that upset them was because both Bullvine and Sophia considered Angela to be their mom, and that this was going to cause great confusion to Bullvine because he thinks Sophia's his sister and that Angela's their mom and all this stuff. And so, Jake was accused of being selfish and inconsiderate, etc. Beth Ann also gives us a very good insight to the dynamics of the Wagners. Again, just kind of confirming what we learned from Tabitha. I forgot to mention that Tabitha said that even the most intimate of affairs was discussed with Angela. They would have family meetings, they would take votes. That's something we learned from Beth Ann as well. But Tabitha would describe at night, Angela would sit on the bed with her and George and talk about what kind of intimate relations they were allowed to have and not allowed to have. Beth Ann would describe a similar situation when she was residing in the home, again, with Angela and George and the two children and Jake. They also started accusing Beth Ann of poisoning them with food. Sound familiar? Stealing. That was something else they accused Tabitha of. And when I say they, it's really mostly Angela accuses these girls and tells the boys about it, and the boys buy it and then unite against the female involved. She also then accused Beth Ann of sexually abusing Sophia. Now, Sophia would not repeat that to anybody else. Jake questioned her, and she denied it. But they confronted Beth Ann in the kitchen out at the Webster Road address, which was the last address we went to where there were two elderly women there. And you guys actually went into the house. So that's the home that the Wagners lived in when they came back from Alaska. And that Beth Ann lived with them. Again, Billy, both during the time at Peterson and the time at Webster, South Webster, lived at the Flying W with his mother. And he lived the first time at 260 Peterson because his father was ailing and he was helping to provide care. But when they got back from Ohio, because his father had passed, and again, noteworthy, they did not return for either one of their father's funerals while they were in Alaska. Despite the fact that I think Angela would tell you that Frederica offered her, I think, $1,000 a month. It might have been more if she let Billy stay and not go to Alaska. So clearly there was sufficient funds to get them back here if they wanted to come back here. So because of this, these accusations and this discontent that Angela had with Beth Ann being there and kind of disrupting the flow, there became this effort to get rid of her, right? And you will hear George say to Jake, the family has spoken. We've decided that she needs to go. Okay, so again, just kind of that emphasis on that family structure and that family dynamic where very insular, both of the boys were homeschooled, they worked together, they, did almost everything together, drove truck together where they're literally together 24 hours a day for 5 days a week, like they'd be gone for 5 days. They confronted Beth Ann about the sexual abuse, and Sophia denied it, and Jake told her that if he ever found out she did it, he would beat her to death with a bat, and if he wasn't able to do it, then his mom would do it. If his mom couldn't do it, then George would do it. If George couldn't do it, then Billy would do it, and that would be the right thing to do. So in the bat, again, is another reference back to The Walking Dead, because it was a specific bat that was used in that show. You will hear George telling Jake that he should have gotten rid of the laptop that was confiscated in Montana. He will hear him telling Jake that he should have smashed his phone rather than give it up to BCI. You will hear George telling Jake that his honesty has gotten them into trouble their entire lives, that Jake is too honest. You will hear George mocking God. Jake is religious, believes in God, and at least during that time, George was very much mocking him for that. You will hear George threatening harm to the agents on the case, and you will hear him saying that it is a family emergency when Special Agent Scheider texts a picture of Jake holding the 1911. They're several states away from Ohio when they get this information, and upon receiving this, it's a family emergency, and they turn the vehicle around and go back. When they try to call off, their bosses say, well, can't the other person, continue on? And they said, no, this is a family emergency. It involves both of us. So you will hear that sort of stuff. And George scolding his mother and father because, according to him, they've always caved whenever they're charged with a crime instead of standing up for it. And, his opinion is you can't beat the charges unless you stand up to them. Again, you'll hear Beth Ann talk about, she actually wrote kind of a Dear Diary letter to her grandfather about who is deceased. So it's more of a journal, writing to herself, but she would write things and then throw them away. Well, you can't throw things away at the Wagner residence because they'll dig it out of the trash, and they'll take a picture of it with a gloved hand, and they'll send it to George. Angela sent it to George, again, just to kind of get the ball rolling on getting rid of Beth Ann, and having George put the pressure on Jake. But she talks about, again, even the most private of all human doings are open for discussion and comment. So again, just that whole thing, and how controlling Angela is, and how all she has to say is that it's for the best interest of the young children. You will also hear George saying that he was putting both Bullvine and Sophia at risk by keeping Beth Ann in the home because he bought into the sexual abuse allegations, again, even though Sophia denied it, and said that if Beth Ann and Jake move out of the home, then Sophia can't go with them. She's staying with George because George will protect her and Jake won't. So again, you just kind of get those kind of family dynamics, that it's all about protecting the children, and kind of these wild accusations that then become, myth becomes legend, basically. The day that Jake and Beth Ann got married, he demanded to have all her passwords and social security number and everything else before they consummated the marriage. They installed a tracking device on her phone. Angela Wagner hired a private investigator to learn more about her. Jake tells her, don't have your family come around here. Don't even tell them where you live, because if they show up, I'd hate to have to kill somebody else. Or somebody, sorry, he did not say somebody else. But again, just kind of that, isolate the women, control them, monitor them, and then these accusations and threats. Simultaneously, we were presenting information to a grand jury. We had Rita Newcomb, which is Angela Wagner's mother, come down and give us a handwriting sample along with Angela Wagner, because on the custody documents, you will see that Rita Newcomb was the notary republic, or the presumed notary public. Found out later that that was not the case, that Angela had also forged her mother's name as the notary. But at that time, we did not yet know that. And we also got shoe sizes and impressions of Jake and Billy and George Wagner. Are we on time? Ooh. Okay, yeah. We're gonna break for you right now, I think, if that's okay.
Can council approach here just a minute? Ladies and gentlemen, we're, due to the hour right now, it would be time to take a break, maybe a little past time. However, if we just take our 15-minute break, then it's going to be pretty choppy between now and a lunch, or you're going to have to eat lunch at 4 o'clock. So we're going to take a lunch break now until 1 o'clock. You're all on your own for lunch. But you do need to time yourselves to be back here, I would say about 5 minutes early. Be down at the jury room on the first floor. You'll be brought up from there by some court personnel. You're going to hear me give you this admonition several times during the course of this trial. However, even if I neglect to do it, this admonition applies at each break. It applies each break, each recess, each day off, and when you're away from the courthouse in the evening between days of trial. The admonition is you are not to discuss this case with anyone. You're not to permit this case to be discussed with you or in your presence. You're not to form or express an opinion concerning this case until it's finally submitted to you for deliberation and verdict. You're not to do any research at all concerning this case, either as to the facts or as to the law. You're not to view, listen to, or read any reports or accounts of this case from any source whatsoever, which would include but not be limited to the internet, Facebook, any social media sites, radio, television, or newspapers. You're not to have any contact with participants in the trial, and that would include, without limitation, of course, the attorneys, parties, or witnesses. And again, you'll be hearing that quite a bit during this trial, but even if I neglect to do it, it applies throughout the trial. Does counsel for either side have anything else that you wish to say at this point before we?
No, thank you.
All right. Then we are in lunch recess until 1 o'clock.